Well, it's already taken place to some extent. There's a degree of autonomy in Scotland, to some extent in Wales. By and large, I think it's a healthy development. Actually, it's taken place on the continent, too. But one of the reactions to the centralization of authority in the European Union has been regionalization. So there's, say, take Spain. The Catalan region, Catalonia, has got a fair degree of autonomy. The Basque region as well. The other regions probably will also. There's a revival of national languages, national cultures, folk cultures, practices. It just becomes a richer, more complex, less rigid society. I mean, imposition of the nation-state systems has been a very violent affair. The British Isles are a perfectly good example. I mean, it took centuries of violence to impose the English rule over the two parts of Britain. Take, say, Catalonia again. It's positive in many respects. Under Franco, for example, Catalan was banned. The nation-state system was imposed by force. Everything had to be Spain. Now it's much freer. They can speak their own language. They can have their own practices. It's a much more lively place. I actually was there before and after. And it's a considerable change. On the other hand, there's a negative side. Catalan autonomy carries with it anti-Spanish racism. So there's severe repression against Spanish working people in Catalonia. Now, that's the dark side of ethnic and cultural identity. And you have to kind of find a way to avoid that and capture the good side.
Wales is well established as a bilingual nation, but a very small percentage of the population speak Welsh as their first language. Do you think this kind of forced bilingualism is a political move, if you like, to reinforce a national identity? Or do you think there's some genuine cultural value in being bilingual?
I think both. I mean, there are genuine values. On the other hand, they shouldn't be forced. When it's forced, it doesn't work very well. So go across the Irish Sea. There they've tried to force Gaelic, but in Dublin, you're not going to hear Gaelic. On the other hand, in Cardiff, you hear kids coming out of school talking Welsh. It wasn't forced in the way it was in Ireland. And I mean, there you'll still hear it in rural areas, but it's kind of imposed on the population. And it hasn't really taken, I don't think. Actually, one of the nice things about traveling in Europe as compared with traveling in the United States is that if you travel, say, from where I live in Boston to Los Angeles, 3,000 miles away, when you get out, it looks like Boston. Slightly different accent, weather's different, but you travel a couple hundred miles in Europe and you're a different place. It's just a much richer kind of environment. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now about the disappearance of languages, and it's almost always discussed in the context of indigenous languages. And it's true, they're disappearing pretty fast. If you take Europe, the languages are also disappearing very fast. It's just they're not called languages. They're called dialects, although they're languages. And they're as separate from one another as the languages are. And so if you go to, say, Italy, there are plenty of people who can't talk to their grandmother because she's talking something they call an Italian dialect, but it's actually a totally incomprehensible language. And it's disappearing under the impact of television, schools,
so you
joining the army.
You think it is the media? You think it is the media that's suppressing these minority languages?
It's a factor. I mean, another thing that's suppressing it, as I presume, is that the people don't want to sustain it. There has to be an effort, a will to sustain it. Actually, I think to an extent, Wales and Ireland reflect that difference. There was evidently more of a will here than in the urban areas of Ireland.
Here in Cardiff, last weekend, we saw 1,500 people protest against the recent cuts and against the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats holding their spring conferences in the city. Do you really think that we can make comparisons between the uprisings in the Arab states and what's going on in the Western world, i.e. us upholding our democratic right to protest?
The trajectories are intersecting, but they're going in opposite directions. In, say, Egypt, people are struggling to gain rights that had been denied them. In the United States, Britain, other European countries, they're struggling to try to retain rights which are being taken away. And in fact, a rather poignant moment in all of this was on February 20th when one of the leaders of the Egyptian labor movement, Kamal Abbas, sent a message of solidarity to the workers of Wisconsin, saying, "We, workers of Egypt, express our solidarity with you in your struggle. You're heading away from democracy and rights. We're heading towards democracy and rights, and our paths are crossing." So it's not actually a comparison, but the coincidence of the events is pretty striking.
I mean, certainly in the Arab states, we've seen a domino effect with what's going on in Tunisia and Egypt and now Libya. What do you think's next? Do you think other countries in the area are going to be hit, especially Saudi? What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, actually, the one to keep an eye on all the way through has been Bahrain. Bahrain is very sensitive. For one thing, it's the home of the Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the region, the U.S. Fifth Fleet. For another, it's a majority Shiite, and it's right across the, about 30 kilometers away from eastern Saudi Arabia, which is both majority Shiite and has most of Saudi oil. And for years, there's been a deep concern of Western planners over a sort of historical and geographical accident, namely half the world's oil is in Shiite areas, eastern Saudi Arabia, Iran, and southern Iraq, all right around the Gulf. And there's a serious concern that if there's a significant democracy movement in Bahrain, it'll spill over to the Shiite areas neighboring it in Saudi Arabia. And that sort of begins to threaten kind of a Shiite alliance controlling all the world's oil. The West will never tolerate that. So that's why the Western, in Egypt, there have been some polite words saying, well, okay, throw out your dictator, but not in Bahrain. That's getting too sensitive. In fact, the Obama administration actually changed the terminology that they're using. Up till the very end, they backed Mubarak. That's the standard game plan, back your favorite dictator as long as possible. When they had to give him up, they started talking about regime change. But in Bahrain, they're talking about regime alteration. And that's supposed to be something milder, like, maybe fiddle with it a little, but no change.
Britain was ashamedly late in offering support to the demonstrators. And even Tony Blair, who admittedly is not the British government, he openly supported Mubarak.
No, he was outrageous. But he has a genius for saying the worst thing ever.
I agree. But why do you think Britain has done that? Why is it not preaching what it practices? Why is it pushing stability over democracy?
Like every other country. U.S. is the same. Obama supported Mubarak right to the end. In fact, at the peak of the demonstrations, Obama sent an emissary to Mubarak, talked about what to do. The man he sent, Frank Wisner, is a lobbyist for Mubarak, and he left Cairo saying, "You are staying." Britain and the United States and France and every other major power are exactly the same. They're very frightened of democracy. And when they say they support stability, remember, stability is a code word. Stability means obedience. So they're not in favor of stability in Iran, let's say. And they weren't in favor of stability in Eastern Europe. In fact, sometimes it's almost comical. One leading U.S. foreign policy analyst, former editor of Foreign Affairs, once wrote an article discussing the U.S. intervention in Chile at the time of the Pinochet dictatorship. He said it was necessary for the United States to destabilize Chile by throwing out the democratic government, installing a dictatorship, in order to preserve stability. So we had to destabilize it to preserve stability. And that's not a contradiction in the technical terms of political discourse, because stability means do what we say. It doesn't mean stability. And sure, that's, I mean, there's no reason to expect a great power to practice what it preaches. That would be outlandish.
Why aren't you on Twitter?
I'm barely on email, only because my teenage son shamed me into it back in the 80s. I'm kind of living the Stone Age. Actually, I don't like it very much, to tell you the truth.
You don't like it?
I mean, it's useful. You know, it does useful things. Like my daughter talks to her children that way. Okay, it's how they keep in contact, college kids. But and it was very valuable in these uprisings. But it has a cheapening effect. I mean, it sort of reduces discourse to complete superficiality. I mean, if you can't say something in 200 characters, it doesn't exist. So any complicated thought is gone.